All right. Melissa, these are Girl Scout chocolate raisins and malted milk balls.
Oh,
So
well, thank you.
we'll keep this around. Anytime someone wants one, just raise your hand and say, pass those things. Okay. Hey, Jeff. Hey. Yeah, right. Good things these days. All right, let me get rid of my gum. All right. Sociocultural approach today is huge, in case you didn't notice in your reading. So it's impossible for us to do everything. So we're going to do parts. I'm going to select parts, and I'll do some. I'm going to use a lot more notes today because, again, cybernetics is my home turf, and phenomenology is my home turf. This is not as much my home turf, so I'll be using more notes. But I'm sure we'll be fine here today. So my goal is I want to go over Craig again to kind of put this all together. We're down to the last two, sociocultural and critical. I mean, critical is really easy. I mean, you'll catch it real quick. You know, it's just get angry and you're doing critical theory. So we'll do critical theory next week. But what I want to do then is to do some of your projects to ask you how you're doing on your theories and applying your theories to things. And I can do a number of examples of different kinds of ways you could apply theories. So I'll offer to do that, and we'll go that way. But we are getting down, to the weeks coming along the line here. So you are going to need to be helping me understand what your focus is so I can design a final exam question for you. Because we're going to design it, custom design it. And because what it should reflect is your interest coming out of comm theory. Coming out of all this stuff. And there's a little paper you're going to write from 2 journal articles. What do you want to know more about and pursue more fully? And so I want to custom design a final exam question for you that could be modified and adapted perhaps into your comp question. So you will want to keep whatever you write for the final exam because it could provide the base for your comp question. So I'm trying to build on your whole program here. Because theory is one of the question areas, theory, research, and some specialty area is the way you do it. Yeah, we're going to do that Monday night, right? Yes. Monday night next week. Yeah.
Is there ever a break point in when we do comps? I don't know if I can get there at 5:30.
Break point. Just come. Just come.
Acceptable?
Yeah, it's acceptable. Just walk in,
okay.
And it's fine. They'll appreciate it. That will become the break point for them. For some reason, graduate students get totally uptight about this, and
because you hear stories and you kind
it's crazy.
I don't know.
It's so wrong.
I've heard about it for 2 years, and I'm kind of a little nervous about it, and I do it next semester.
It's so wrong. The point is to be a learning moment for us together. You're not defending a doctoral thesis, for heaven's sakes. You're just reporting on that. You learn stuff, and you can talk about it. So.
But it sounded like last year some people really got criticized.
I don't remember.
About APA and Wikipedia. I didn't go, but I heard.
Well, yeah. Well, don't.
Wikipedia in a high school. So in high school, I wouldn't put. They didn't really.
Well, people do. We have people doing it in grad school. You can use it by all means. Use it for
find something else.
Get yourself organized, but don't quote it in a
common sense,
academic paper. Well, people do, right? And we may not have that same. Every professor has a different focus in that regard. I don't think we'll see that same focus this year. People have different things they're interested in. When Dr. Kent used to be here, he was very rigid about APA. You couldn't even have one One mistake, you know. And then another professor that we had for a while was really into citations and your bibliography. But that's not necessarily going to be this year, too. So we'll see how it goes. Should be a good year for graduate students going through this year. All right, let's talk about sociocultural theories. Now, I was talking to my undergraduate class today, too. You have to realize that in the field of communication studies, it's not like physics, right? Where physics has one theory of matter. You know, it's like either the atomic Newtonian theory or the quantum theory. So physics, your course on theories of physics is a really short course, you know, because you have one theory, you know, to study. But there are 300 or more theories of communication. And that's because it's a big field. It changes. You know, we're going to talk about Marshall McLuhan today, and as new media come around, you get new theories of how that works and stuff. So we have a very big field. So Craig tries to divide it into these areas, you know, the traditions. So we're using the traditions. And they overlap. You know, some of the things, you ran into Burke again in sociocultural, but we did Burke under rhetorical. So, you know, they kind of fall in different places. So I'm not going to do Burke again, unless you really want to do Burke again. No, I'm just going to let Burke go. We'll do more speech act today. We'll do some media theories, and maybe touch on organizational culture as part of a study. But, okay, so to look at this, every one of the traditions thinks about some particular focus of attention. All right, so the rhetorical theory said that when we think about communication, we're thinking about everyday questions that have to be answered that have no clear answers. So we theorize it as practical discourse. How do we make choices? How do we persuade each other that this is the best choice? We talked about semiotic, which focused very heavily on the actual signs that were used in the communication process. So how do things become signs? How do signs relate to each other? How does a sign come to have a meaning? So those were questions there. And then the phenomenological, the encounter with the other, and how do we experience life on the surface of things. The cybernetic was the way in which information travels through organizations in complex ways, complex interactions, systems theory. You know, I don't like Craig's. I think Craig's chart here is attenuated. I think it's too narrow on cybernetic, you know. Then we did socio-psychological, which dealt with the individual and their characteristics or traits, their attributes. So how are we influenced to change our attitudes? Or we talk about central processing and peripheral processing and elaboration, likelihood, and all of these kinds of things. And again, every theory has language that it uses for its analysis. And this is very important. I haven't stressed this probably enough. And one of the reasons I say that is because it's not showing up strongly in the reflections. So what's happening in the reflections is you are identifying good incidents, you are locating them in a tradition, but where the gap is that you're not taking this language and, you know, mixing it together. So you're not able to say, all right, this is an example of an indexical sign, you know, that is, you know, use the language to match up with things. So we want to kind of push that a little bit as we get down the road here. This gives you the handles or the descriptive language for making analysis. So if you're doing an analysis from a cybernetic, you should be talking, in your analysis, these words should appear. That there's a redundancy in the way this works, and there's feedback happening, and there are, there are self-organizing systems. That you almost want to take a, remember how in grade school they said, use these 5 words in a paragraph. I mean, you almost want to do that. You almost want to take your vocabulary and your experience and use these 5 words in a paragraph about this experience. So weave that language. And when you talk about comms, this is part of what we look for. This is part of what we look for is, all right, you've identified that as a socio-psychological issue. Explain that more. What things about it are socio-psychological? What are, and if you can start to say, well, what we did was, what we were looking at are 5 variables about personality. And our academic brains go off, I heard variables. It's good. So it's socio-psychological. These words are the stuff that makes it that kind of an analysis, not just identifying it. That's probably the biggest problem that we run into. People can identify things, but then not push through the vocabulary into it and find the things that work. So sociocultural asks these kinds of language. It thinks about, when it looks at communication happening, it says, how is there a duplication or a reproducing of some kind of a structured way of being together? How is that this group of people somehow live together? They do things together. And that's fascinating to a sociocultural person. How in the world do people actually cooperate and they work together instead of just being all, their own thing, doing their own thing? They actually think alike and they engage in rituals. Like this is, to a sociologist, this is a ritual. What we do here, it's predictable. It has a beginning, it has an end. We know pretty much what's going to happen throughout it, and we enact it. And every time we come here, we reproduce this social ritual called a graduate class in communication theory. And to a sociologist, it's fascinating to say, why do people keep doing it? And why don't they do something else? Or why don't we stand on our heads one day? Or why don't we sit in circles? Or, what explains this? So they're interested in the question of how, and from a communication standpoint, how is the exchange of symbols implicated in the reproduction of social order? So again, from an organizational cultural communication standpoint, what is it about a logo? There's a semiotic dimension to that, but there's also a sociocultural dimension to that, because it becomes a thing around which we organize our ritual of work. Or some companies, your book made the point that some other countries will have companies that sing songs together about the company. IBM used to do this. They used to have a songbook, a corporate songbook, and their executives and managers would get together and they would sing out of these songbooks. Well, what was that about?
A hymnal?
Yeah, well, they didn't call it a hymnal. It's religious. Yeah, it was a book of corporate songs, and and they would all be there in their suits, and they would all sing these songs, and it sounds weird to us, but it's organizational culture enacted. And what the sociocultural person says is that communication is re-entrenching in people's minds these rules and these values and these structures. And so let's take that IBM executive singing from a songbook, a corporate songbook, and let's look at it, let's just kind of work our way across again and think about it. From a socio-psychological perspective, what might you be interested in that event, in that communication event of 150 managers singing a corporate song?
The effects that it has on the behavior of members.
Right. You might measure their cooperation variable, their attitude toward the company variable. So you would look to isolate some characteristics, and then you would measure the effect of this thing on them. That would be a socio-psychological way to look at it. How about a cybernetic way of looking at that? What might we look systemically, or a pattern of interaction there? That's a little weak, harder.
How the system function.
Right, we'd ask, what role does this play in the overall system of things? How is it related to something that comes before it, something that comes after it? What does it mean if you don't participate in it? Because it's all connected.
Well, I was going to say, what information gets passed through that route?
Right, you could look at the information transfer question. Right, and you might even ask, I don't know that you would ask the singing question. To me, that would be a socio-psychological question. That does singing open different processing routes than saying something, or does saying something together change the way it happens? Psychologically, those would be questions you might ask. Phenomenological is pretty easy to work with in that regard. So, what would you be asking about? Ben?
Kind of how it brings people together, the singing.
Okay, you would ask, what is your experience of the singing? You would do a qualitative interviews with people. What does it mean to you to sing these things? What do you like singing them? How do you feel about? Yeah, you would ask the meaning for you. What does it mean to the people who are actually involved in it? And so a phenomenologist would ask that. Semiotician.
What words are used and how they impact?
It would be really about the signs, the meanings of the signs, the connotations, the denotations of the words. Semiotician might look at the clothes, the arrangement of the people.
Would singing itself be semiotic, or would it fall into
I don't know.
like why
That's
they
a good
think
thought.
Kind of like talking or chanting or
I thought of that maybe if
You-
you go into cybernetics and see if you change that, how is it going to affect the whole cycle? I mean, what is the
Yeah, well, in
like the poems?
semiotics, we play with that switching. So if it was a poem or if it was chanted instead, how would that change the meaning of it, right? So is singing a sign in itself? Yeah, so that would be a semiotics. And also the actual book itself, the print of the book, the color of the book, is it got gold binding on it? Is it cardboard? What? We would ask those questions about the symbols and the signs that are part of it. And then a rhetorical person might ask, I'm trying to think, rhetorical is a little weak for me on this.
What would be the purpose first and see
Yeah.
it uses to?
I mean, what are the arguments in the songs? I mean, you could look at the...
Yeah,
How are the
what
lyrics
would be
written?
the specific words
Right.
that are used in the song?
Well,
songs and like.
you would like it to arguments. What is it trying to make? What is it trying to change in your life? Is it accomplishing that? How does it do that? You know, what appeals are made in the song? You know, to family, to country. Yeah, how does it? So that would be a rhetorical study.
But even if it wasn't like just the words, just the fact that like the reason they're singing in the first place is to like motivate, with whether they were motivated because of like what the words itself were, or just if they all got together and sang like, you know, like I can't even think of a little kid song like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. If it did its job that it was intended to do.
Well, the sociocultural would be more inclined to say, it really doesn't matter what they're singing. What's important is that they are doing a ritual together. And it's in the enacting of a ritual that social cohesion takes place. Right. So the sociocultural person would ask, how does this ritual function within the culture, the beliefs, the attitudes, the values, the stories that are told, the shared life of these people? What role does it play in that? And a critical theory would ask, you know, who benefits? Who has the power to make people stand up and look like idiots? You know, and where's the resistance to that? And how do people, you know, do they actually tap their foot during it as a form of rebellion? You know, I mean, what do they do? You know, how do they manage it? So reproduction of the social order is our, and these are some of the kind of things they look for. Is there the problems? So in a sociocultural perspective, you look for problems related to where people are not able to do things together. If it's about people doing things together, then if there's conflict or there's people on the outside or they can't coordinate their behaviors, how come? And what does communication have to do with that? So those would be the questions you would ask. So again, this is not all that different from what you're trying to look at in your consulting project, in the sense that if someone says to you, oh, we have a problem around here, we don't feel like we're working together, we feel like we don't have cohesion as a team or as a company, you know, that kind of should set off some sociocultural genes in your communication life that say, all right, well, maybe we can ask the question, are there shared rituals? Are there ways in which people share symbols and engage symbols together? So you talk about things that don't work together, failure communication. This is some of the language that you talk about. Structures, rules, how do we make this together? I don't know if that reproduction functions well for you. That's a very important concept, Lori.
For the project, like for instance, just say they come to us with that.
Right.
Now would you, to present it to them, do you look for articles like that and then kind of say this is how it's been done in the past, or are you just kind of analyzing using the terminology assigned with it and then kind of coming up with something new? And
no, it would be better, I think, in your...
What are you looking for? I guess that's
I'm looking for you to make a professional presentation to them, recommending certain communication practices on the basis of your knowledge of communication theory. So it may bolster your argument to say, you know, you presented us with this issue that your team lacks coordination, has no sense of being a team, and so forth and so on. So we have a way of thinking about things like that. And you don't have to explain sociocultural and all that stuff, but say, and so we're thinking that what you might want to do is strengthen the culture, shared culture of the group. And here's the one way they did it in this company. So you find an example from the textbook or an article. And here's another way that this group strengthened their culture. So on the basis of these things, we think you should do these 4 things. You should, institute a company picnic. You should get a songbook. I don't know. I don't know. But you should do these 4 things in order to, and these are built around the concept that culture is strengthened and reproduced as people engage in rituals and practices together that give them a sense of belonging to a group. So that would be really compressed form of it. This is where we start to get into this whole question of the identity formation that we struggled with in socio-psychological. This gets us into the social formation of the self. And you read a little section in your book about the construction of emotions. I don't know how you reacted to that, but that's that's part of this idea, is that we kind of take for granted that everyone feels the same kind of emotions that we feel. And sociocultural people, at least some of them, would argue that emotions are a constructed response as we learn to name socially our physical states. And that not every culture will name the states in the same way, and so people will respond emotionally differently to things. Now, some people are really bothered by the idea that your emotions are not like who you really are. But socioculturalists say it's not who you really are, it's who you in community have become.
And just to understand, so and the point that I was getting was that unless you have that understanding that you're on the same page there in terms of what this emotion is, you're not having communication.
Right, you have a misalignment, a failure of coordination with these people. You will not be able to adequately understand or relate with them. Which is where the ethnography comes in, in this part of the study, and the thick description of cultures through ethnographic qualitative methodologies.
Could that be also generational? Not just,
Yeah.
I was thinking about like World War II veterans don't really get it, this whole post-traumatic stress thing, like my dad would, kind of like roll his eyes whenever he heard it.
Right.
But now it's on the news, it's front and center, it's understood.
Yeah, that's a socially constructed emotion, right, that has meaning now, and people enact it because it's identified. It's tough to think, about. You could say, well, they had it before, they did it before, but they called it something else and they've reacted to it differently. Right. In women's studies, they make a big deal around hysteria. Those of you who have studied women's studies, and during a certain period of history, women would have this a thing that would come upon them, right? And it would be, and they thought it was related to the uterus and and so, but everyone had this. It was a thing that happened to a lot of people, and they came. Then all of a sudden, as culture changed, it didn't happen anymore. So they think that it was a culturally constructed emotion, and a culture that was a way in which you were expected to react to certain things, and so you did. So, so it looks at the individual as a product of society. So your socio-psychological is more the idea that society is the sum of a bunch of people, individuals, and what they do. you know. So you can explain society by the individuals. The sociocultural says you can explain the individual by the social. You start with the social, which then has shaped the individual, the self. And you read about George Herbert Mead, the I and the me, and the reflective self and the social self. So the idea that I have many identities, or Goffman would say I have many identities that I enact as part of my performance of self in the world. And so if you ask, who are you really, like a phenomenologist would ask,